Well, hello everyone. Welcome back. I'm very pleased to have with me today a Dr. Jeremiah Carey. Um, Jeremiah got his PhD in philosophy at University of California, Berkeley, and he specialized in ethics and moral psychology. And then he went on to do some teaching at Siena College in upstate New York, and has since transitioned into primarily being a software engineer, but he's still very active researcher and considers philosophy his primary vocation. And I'm glad of that too, because he's been writing some very interesting things. And recently he published a paper on Orthodox panentheism. So that's going to be the focus of what I talked to with Jeremiah about today. So, Jeremiah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great treat for me. I mentioned in our conversation in setting it up that I haven't seriously talked philosophy out loud with anybody in about 3 years since I left academia. So this is a treat on the one hand, but on the other hand, hopefully my rustiness doesn't come through too much.
No, I think you're going to do a great job, and I'm looking forward to having this discussion. So, thank you so much. Well, let's dive right into it. So, in your article on Orthodox panentheism, you discuss several important approaches to monotheism that are prominent in the contemporary discussion. So you talk about conceptions of God you refer to as classical theism, theistic personalism. You also reference pantheism and then, of course, panentheism. Now, for those watching this who may not be familiar with all those different terms, could you just kind of break these different conceptions of God down for us?
Sure. Yeah. So there's separate sorts of distinctions that I mention in the paper. So on the one hand, there's this distinction, and I'll say both sets of distinctions I think are problematic in various ways. But so on the one hand, there's this distinction between theism, pantheism, and panentheism. So pantheism is maybe the easiest to start with. It's the view that God and the world. So these are different views of the God-world relationship. So in pantheism, the idea is that God and the world are just sort of one and the same thing. There's no real distinction at all between God and the world. God and the world are exactly the same. Um, so that's like on one extreme. On the other extreme, if you want to think of it this way, is theism, which says, no, God and the world, they're two different things, right? So there's God on the one hand, there's the world on the other hand. God made the world. Um, so God's has maybe a different kind of existence, but they're just two different things um, that exist alongside each other, we'll say. And so panentheism tries to be a sort of a middle ground between those two. So according to panentheism, God and the world are in some sense distinct. They can't just be identified with each other. But they're not really two separately existing things either. So panentheism, so pan means all and en means in. So panentheism is the view not that all is God, but that all is in God, and God is in all things. Um, and so, on this way of drawing the distinction, it seems to me that, at least personally speaking, panentheism seems by far the most appealing view, and it seems the view that has the most sort of like patristic support in the tradition, right? So, in the paper, I give this long list of quotes from prominent church fathers who all say very clearly things like, everything is in God, God is in everything. So, on this way of drawing the distinction, it seems like, oh, we who sort of share the same sorts of
Right.
views that I do, we should all be panentheists. Um, However, that also is problematic for a couple reasons. So one reason that it's problematic is just that historically speaking, in the sort of in academic literature, when people have drawn this distinction, the primary people who have considered themselves panentheists have had views which are not orthodox in the sort of lowercase o sense. Um, so in
Right.
particular, panentheism is most associated with um, process theology, which sees uh, God sees the world as God is sort of like transcending the world, but that his being is still sort of like tied up in the world, so that as the world develops, that is a development of God's own being in some way, um, which is obviously not a view that sort of like Orthodox Christianity accepts. Um, so on the one hand, you might think, well, maybe we shouldn't call ourselves panentheists because it risks us being associated with all these sort of uh, views that we might not want to associate with. Um, But on the other hand, and I think more importantly, the initial sort of explanation of theism that I gave in drawing out that distinction itself seems kind of problematic in that you might think that doesn't really capture the theistic tradition, what you would call the classical theistic tradition, what most theologians who consider themselves theists throughout uh, history have accepted. Um, and so that leads into this other way of drawing a distinction that I got from Brian Davies between what he calls theistic personalism and classical theism. And so theistic personalism accepts a view in the end that is kind of like this view of what I call theism in explaining the first distinction, where God and the world are just sort of like two distinct things. God is the creator of the world. And for him, the reason it's called theistic personalism is because this kind of starting point of this view of God is the idea that God is a person. Um, and so this is actually sort of very common in analytic philosophy of religion, this sort of view. It's the view that I just sort of like thought was the obvious one in my own philosophical upbringing and as a Protestant. And he even quotes, let me find the question, Richard Swinburne, right, who has who's a very important in analytic philosophy of religion. And he says
Yeah.
in his book, oh, sorry, I was looking at the wrong thing here. My printer wasn't working. He says in his book, The Existence of God, that a theist is a man, quote, a man who believes there is a God, whereby God, the theist, understands something like a person without a body. And then later in the book, he says that God is a person, yet one without a body seems the most elementary claim of theism. Right. So this is an interesting way of thinking about God because it seems like explicitly anthropomorphic, right? Because we start with
Right.
our idea of a person, which obviously we only get from the people we know who are human beings, and we think, oh, God is like this, just, and then you kind of modify this concept of personhood. You take away the body, you take away imperfections, you add in the perfections, and that's how you get your concept of God.
You give them
Um,
superpowers, like
yeah, more or less. Um,
maximal knowledge and maximal goodness and stuff like that. Yeah.
yeah. And so if you have this view of God, that matches more or less with that initial view of theism that I gave, where God is just like another thing, like we are, right? It's just that he's more powerful and he doesn't have a body. So he's just like one of the other things that have existence. He's just special in various uh, ways. Whereas the classical theistic picture, according to Davies, uh, is in a way more philosophical, and it starts not with the idea of God being a person like us, but what it would be for God to sort of explain existence or in general. So the primary idea isn't God as a person, but God as creator. And so uh, this view of God is very different, right? The idea, if God created everything, then God just, it couldn't be one of the things that there are. Right? So you get this idea that somehow God is the source of all being, and therefore, in some sense, nothing has being except for insofar as God gives it being. So God has to sort of be the primordial being, but he's also not a being. He's sort of uh, outside of being, beyond being. And so this is a sort of much, it seems to me now at least anymore, anyway, a much richer and more interesting picture of what God is and how he relates to the world. And the thing to notice about it is that it doesn't see God and the world as in the initial distinction as just being sort of alongside each other, right? It seems a lot closer to how I described panentheism. According to classical theism, God is fully transcendent of reality, but he's also in some sense the being of everything that has being. Um, so it gives you, you might think, this immanence and transcendence that the panentheist wants. Um, so then that raises the question, why be a panentheist? Why say that you're a panentheist? Why not just say you're a classical theist? Because classical theism seems to give you the sorts of things that you wanted to get by calling yourself a panentheist. Um, and so in the paper, I mean, I'm not super wedded to the idea that I'm a panentheist. I mean, I think it can be a helpful term. And so in the paper, the reason I say why I'm calling the view a type of panentheism rather than a type of classical theism is for two reasons. So I think the label classical theism is both too narrow and too broad to really be useful. So it's too broad in the sense that um, at least Davies' way of drawing this distinction, it's not like universally accepted within the philosophy of religion world. In fact, I remember when I was writing this paper, I was trying to find like people who like took this seriously and talked about it, because there are a lot of people for whom it was important, like me. And actually, I think I found out about it first through David Bentley Hart mentioned it in one of his writings, The Experience of God, which was kind of uh,
Yes.
very eye-opening for me at the time I read it. But it's not, it's just like it's not something that has really got all that much traction. And in fact, I think a lot of people who he considers theistic personalists would consider themselves classical theists, right? So I
Right.
even remember when I took my first philosophy of religion class, and it was by somebody, Tom Crisp. He's an amazing person and teacher.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But he was a student of Alvin Plantinga, who is, you know, another sort of paradigm example of someone that Davies would consider a theistic personalist. And I remember in my first philosophy of religion class, classical theism was just sort of a classical theist was just somebody who accepted basically the uh, Judeo-Christian Islamic view of God. Um,
Right.
so on the one hand, I think classical theism risks being too broad of a view because for most
Yeah.
people, a classical theist is just somebody who is, a Christian or Muslim or Jew who believes in God in that sense. Um, but on the other hand, I think it's too narrow because even if we were to say, well, I'm using classical theism in the way that Davies uses it, Davies is pretty explicit when he talks about it that he has in mind uh, a particular philosophical tradition, theological philosophical tradition, which primarily sort of, or at least finds its culmination in the sort of medieval scholastic Latin and Arabic theology of people like, Aquinas and Maimonides and various Islamic philosophers in that time period. Um, and I just think the tradition that I'm interested in, the tradition that at least in my presentation of it, finds its culmination in St. Gregory Palamas, it's just a different tradition, right? It's just not that medieval scholastic Latin or Arabic speaking tradition. Um,
Right.
so I think in that sense, it would be a little bit misleading also to say that this is classical theism. Because the main thing, and again, I'm not super wedded to the idea of panentheism as being like the label that Orthodox people should accept for themselves. But given the way that the distinctions are drawn in the sort of literature that I was looking at, um, it seemed to me helpful because it's a way of getting across that this Orthodox tradition that I'm looking at is both seems like a type of panentheism, the way people usually talk about panentheism, but it's also different than the sort of Latin tradition that Davies and the Thomists and these guys um, have in mind when they talk about classical theism. So sorry, that
Yeah.
was probably pretty long.
No, that was great. It's perfect. And I'm really sympathetic to everything you're saying. I have noticed that as well. Like, either the problem is that people when they say classical theism, they maybe just mean the theism as it's understood by someone like Thomas Aquinas, it's like you said, or they mean they're trying this blanket statement, which actually covers a broad range of really nuanced views of thinking about God.
Mhm.
So maybe it's not the most helpful label. Yeah, I also understand. I know some people that who we might, like Davies might label as a theistic personalist, and they don't even like that term. They get upset about
Mhm.
it. I'm thinking especially of like Ryan Mullins. I don't know if you know him, but he does not like the term theistic personalism, and is kind of gets upset when people use
Yeah.
that term.
It seemed to me it's been a while, but I think the like neoclassical theism is the label that a lot of people who Davies think of as theistic personalists would prefer for themselves.
But
Um,
that view is also like I find like that's not very helpful because it almost paints this picture like there was this monolithic view that we call classical theism that like all these people had, and then there's this shift, from that to this neoclassical view. So
mhm.
yeah, finding the right terms can be difficult, and no, I get what you're saying, and so trying to find a term like panentheism that might be more helpful is a good thing. But that kind of leads to, I guess, my next question. Um, because you also mentioned that oftentimes even that term panentheism is kind of unilluminating because it can be used in different ways by different people. You already mentioned like process theologians using it and how that's
Mhm.
like maybe different from how you're using it. Um, so I guess what would you need to be done? Like what would need to be done to develop a more precise or fine-grained formulation of panentheism? Um,
Yeah, so I think, I mean, when I was looking at some of the people who are worried about panentheism, and actually Ryan Mullins has a paper about demarcating panentheism that I think I cite. Um, I think there's actually two separate problems that people have. So on the one hand, there's the problem that a lot of different people call themselves panentheists, whereas from the outside, if you just like look at all these different people who say that they're panentheists, it looks like they have absolutely nothing in common, right? Their views actually seem like totally, contradicting one another, and it's just like, so I think this is Mullen's main problem. It's just like if we're going to think of panentheism as a distinctive sort of view, like the right way we should do that to start with, you might think, is to like, okay, look at all these people that call themselves panentheists and find out what they have in common. And it turns out there is nothing they have in common, other than that they use the word, I guess. So I think that's one sort of problem, which I don't, I'm not going to try to solve that problem. I don't have any desire to like try to figure out what all the people who call themselves panentheists have in common. The other problem is just that even looking at particular people who call themselves panentheists. And so, I mean, I'm not the first Orthodox person to, I mean, Metropolitan Kallistos Ware has at least a couple papers where he talks about why panentheism might be a good name for this sort of like Orthodox view. Um, so the second problem is just that even looking at people who uh, individual people who say this view is panentheistic or this view is a type of panentheism, that they don't get philosophically in the weeds enough, I guess, so to speak, right? So panentheism is the idea that God is in the world and the world is in God in some sense, right? And so you might say, yeah, orthodoxy is panentheistic because, I mean, look at all these quotes, the sorts of things that I mentioned, right? So, like just to choose one at random. Um, so St. Athanasius says, God encloses all things and is enclosed by none within all things and yet without all things, right? So there we go. God's in everything and yet he's not in everything, right? That's panentheism. And so you might say, like, yeah, this is panentheism because look at all these people who say these things, right? This is our view. But the problem there is, and this is what I try to answer a little bit more in my paper is, well, okay, you can say God is in the world and the world is in God, but like, but in what way? Right? Like that's just a metaphor, right? It's just a metaphor to say that all things are in God and God is in all things, unless you think that God is like literally in space in some way and that we occupy the same space as God. And like, I mean, and that would just be one way of spelling out the metaphor, right? It's clearly meant to be a metaphor. And so the question is, yeah, I mean, what
right.
does it mean to say that the world is in some sense in God? Well, in what sense? Um, and so, the main problem is that it seems like most of the people who have tried to say that they're panentheists just haven't really gone very far in trying to give any sense to this idea that is supposed to be foundational. And so I
Yeah.
try to do that a little bit. I don't know if I make much progress, but
No, I think you have. So that's actually very helpful because and it is somewhat ironic considering that, one might be attracted to the term panentheism because it might seem a bit more well defined than say a term like classical theism or neoclassical theism, those kind of things. But then it turns out we have a kind of a similar problem where you have panentheism being used in all these different ways. So yeah, I think this is why I find your paper very helpful because you look specifically at Saint Gregory Palamas, who's a very, for those who don't know, very significant saint in the Orthodox Church. And you explain that Saint Gregory offers a more detailed and illuminating account of panentheism. Before you talk about that, I guess there are likely people who, even though he's becoming a little bit more well known, I think in the West, there still might be a lot of people who aren't familiar with Saint Gregory Palamas. So you don't have to give like a huge, but biography or anything. But tell us a little bit about Saint Gregory, at least you know for those who may not know who he is.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm no specialist in St. Gregory, but as you mentioned, he's definitely a very, very important saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Um, I mean, so important that like, he's given a special day just for him in Lent every year that like we celebrate him. He's got his own feast day like most of the other saints do, but then also every single Lent, like it's so important that we like emphasize that he was right about the stuff that he was arguing about.
Awesome.
Um, so yeah, so he was a saint who lived in the sort of early to mid 14th century. So I think he was born in 1296. So I mean, so for people who don't know the history, like to put that in perspective, that's like, less than 300 years after the Great Schism between what became the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. And this was about, 50 to 70 years after St. Thomas Aquinas was around and writing. So it's kind of around that same sort of time period. But in the Byzantine Empire. So uh, we don't know exactly where he was born, probably in Constantinople. And he was raised by a noble family, so we know he got a very good education. So he knew a lot about Greek philosophy, and there are even stories about how he was especially sort of talented as a student and an imitator of Aristotle, which I found very interesting, especially because Aristotle within the Orthodox Church is not usually um, looked upon as kindly as he is in the sort of Western Church. Um, although, but anyway, I won't get into that.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. Maybe we should
Yeah,
talk about that some other day.
yeah. So anyway, so we know he was born to a noble family. We know he studied Greek philosophy. We know he studied Aristotle and that he was good at philosophy. But basically, from very early on, he just wanted to be a monk, and so he eventually became a monk, and he was sort of raised spiritually by these groups of monks who practiced what became known as hesychasm, which becomes very important later. And so the hesychasts, it was this very sort of like inward focused, meditative sort of spirituality. Um, and so when he became a monk, he basically just wanted to be one of these hesychasts. He wanted to sort of live this life of seclusion and detachment and inner stillness and seek union with God. And insofar as he did write, I mean, almost all of his early writings were hagiography. So mostly what he was interested in writing about was lives of the saints, right? So he had this great philosophical education on the one hand, but he also was like very, very deeply interested in the lives and the writings of the saints. So he also knew the sort of like Christian tradition very, very well. Um, but various things kept him from living this life of seclusion that he wanted. I mean, partly there was political sort of intrigues. The Turks were constantly invading the Byzantine Empire at that time, and he sort of got caught up in that at various points. But what really brought him out of his shell, if you want to think of it that way, was um, a debate with another Greek monk named Barlaam, who was from southern Italy originally, but at that time, southern Italy was very largely Greek speaking and even Orthodox. Um, and so anyway, what was interesting was the initial debate was uh, about the Trinity, and so Barlaam was actually one of the few people at that time. He was a very well known as a teacher of uh, philosophy and of languages. So he was actually fluent in Latin and Greek, which was very, very rare at that time. And so Barlaam actually, I think it was in Constantinople, had a debate with two representatives of the Latin Church about the filioque. Um, and uh, Barlaam was actually defending the Orthodox side against the Latins. But St. Gregory got word of his arguments of this debate, and he actually, rather than going after the Latins, he didn't like the way that Barlaam was arguing against the Latin view. He thought it depended on some problematic views about our knowledge of God. Um, and so I won't get into that in part because I don't know the details, but I just thought that was interesting. Uh, and so St. Gregory started to argue against Barlaam's views, and Barlaam got really upset about this. And instead of attacking St. Gregory directly, he started writing these things against the hesychasts. Um, and what he wrote was, I mean, he basically made fun of these guys. He thought they were just like crazy. And to be fair, I mean, he got his views by actually like talking to hesychasts. Um, but I mean, that's generally a problem. You don't generally want to like figure out how to think about issues in theology by like just interviewing random people. um,
Yeah.
because random people tend to not really know what they're talking about, or at least not to be very good at expressing it. Um, and so he said all these really sort of said all these critical things about the Hesychasts that painted them in a really negative light, and that really made St. Gregory upset. And so there was sort of this back and forth debate that lasted a long time, lots of synods and councils involved. And eventually Barlaam left. He gave up and joined the Latin Church and became a bishop in Italy. And eventually St. Gregory was sort of vindicated, and his defense of hesychasm became sort of like part of Orthodox dogma, so to speak. Um, and so, yeah. And so St. Gregory, although I sort of tie in, as I'm sure we'll talk about soon, his uh, theology with some sort of like an interesting philosophical history. I should emphasize that St. Gregory was not interested in doing philosophy, and he wouldn't have seen himself as like inheriting these Platonist ideas necessarily. He was interested in primarily he was interested in defending the idea that the hesychasts, through their prayer, were able to directly experience God. Right. So that was the
Yeah.
fundamental question, was whether or not we can have direct and real experience of God, um, sort of in our life here on earth. And the Hesychasts claimed that they could. Barlaam thought they couldn't. And so in the uh, process of trying to defend the Hesychasts, uh, St. Gregory ended up appealing to this essence energies distinction, uh, which, although it was meant to vindicate this idea, this sort of like, or it was meant to play a part in this theological controversy about whether or not these particular people are capable of having experience of God. Um, I think it ended up sort of developing these views about the God-world relationship that were present in the Greek-speaking tradition in an interesting and sort of helpful way.
Yeah.
Again,
Well,
sorry,
thank you
again, that was
so
probably
much.
way
Then
too.
that was a really great overview of his life. Um, and so that just sets us up then for getting into the nitty gritty and talking about his views. So, to set the discussion up in the paper, at least, you mentioned that there are some Platonic assumptions that undergird his position, and really that highly influenced many of these ancient Eastern Christian thinkers. So, I guess before we can talk more about the essence energies distinction and St. Gregory's kind of panentheism, we should maybe introduce some of the concepts that are important from Platonism for understanding this discussion. So, yeah, could you kind of walk us through a few of the key Platonic ideas that
Yeah,
underlie?
sure. And I mean, I do so with some trepidation because again, this is like a complicated, long, hotly debated issue. But it was important to me in the paper because I mean, a lot of what I say is indebted to this paper by Eric Pearl, that for me really helps me. I feel like to understand for the first time, sort of like what's really philosophically interesting about the essence energies distinction, and
Mm,
also the way in which there might be a legitimate difference here between what the Orthodox tradition following St. Gregory has to say about the God-world relationship and what you get in the more Thomistic, sort of classical theistic view. Um, and that difference comes down to, at least as I put it in the paper, more or less this idea of participation and how we think of participation. And so when you talk about participation, that brings us all the way back to Plato, right? Um, so there is this Neoplatonic inheritance in Christianity that I think is just sort of like unavoidable and that is present,
mm,
um, if not equally, very strongly present in both the sort of Greek East and the Latin West. And so when we think about Platonism and Plato's views, primarily what we're thinking about is probably going to be the theory of forms. So the theory of forms were meant to answer this sort of like very fundamental question that arises when we think about how we understand or know the world, right? So whenever we to put it in kind of contemporary terms, whenever we understand something in the world, we do so by applying concepts to it. Right? So I don't really know who you are or what you are until I understand that you're a human being and that maybe you're a man and that you're a philosopher, right? I apply these concepts to you. But the thing to notice is that whenever I apply any of these concepts to you, human being, philosopher, man, um, these concepts are things that are not sort of like yours alone, right? So I'm applying them to you to understand you, but they're things that other people have in common, right? I'm also a human being and a man and a philosopher. Um, and so there's this uh, let me come at it a different way, right? So this seems like fundamental to our understanding of the world is that we're able to look at different things and yet find something that's in common to them, right? So this is like sometimes it's put as the question of the one in the many, right? Um, and so Plato has a particular theory about how this works, right? So we might have this, we might look around and we might say, oh, like this is red, this is red, this is red. Um, so on the one hand, there are many different red things, and yet they seem to have something in common. And what they have in common is like that in virtue of which they're red. But what is that thing? Well, it seems like, I mean, it seems like it is a thing, right? We say they have something in common. Otherwise, they wouldn't all be red. And furthermore, it seems like whatever this thing is that they have in common has to play some like explanatory role in why they all have in common what they have in common. And so Plato famously thought, well, what they have in common is that they participate in this form of redness. So not only are there all these different red things, but there's somehow like redness itself. And this has to be like the truly red thing, right? This is like there's redness itself, there's the truly red, and then there are different red things. And and we need to sort of like posit this idea of redness itself to help explain what it is that makes these different red things red. And the answer is they all are red in virtue of this relationship they have to redness itself. Um, so that's like a very simplistic, quick overview of the theory of the forms. And so it does some like interesting explanatory work in metaphysics, right? It explains why things are the way that they are. Why is anything the way that it is? Well, because it has some relationship to something that's like more fundamental and more really real, which explains why the things have the properties or characteristics that they do. This way of thinking about things, though, raises certain questions or issues, right? So, and Plato raises some of these in the dialogue Parmenides. And so, like, most fundamentally, the worry is that, like, well, we need to say more about what this notion of participation is. Um, so, how exactly are the red things related to redness itself? And so you might think, oh, well, maybe it's like each red thing has like a part of redness. So redness somehow like gets divided into parts, and each red thing has like a little part of redness itself. But that seems really problematic because well, first of all, like we wanted redness to just be like simple. Like it seemed important that there was just like one thing that was redness, and now we're breaking it into parts. But furthermore, if you break it into parts and everything gets a part of redness, they don't really have anything in common anymore, right? Because
Mm.
there's no one thing redness that they all have in common. What they all have is just different separable parts of redness.
Mm.
So if we do that, we don't really can't do the explanatory work that we were trying to do. Um, so that makes it seem like, oh, what we've got to do is say redness itself is undivided, and instead every red thing has like all of redness in it. But that's really hard to make sense of too, because like how can one simple thing be spread out fully at the same time, like into all these different things that exist across space and time? That doesn't really make much sense either. So there's like interesting questions about there. How can in other words, we haven't really solved this one many question fully. And so in sort of the Neoplatonic development of Platonism, there's like it's explicitly understood that being itself somehow has to have this one many relationship built into it. And so I think that's the sense in which when we get to St. Gregory, that you can see the essence energy distinction as being like a really like really clearly a culmination of this sort of Platonic question of the one to many, because the view is that God himself somehow has this one many thing built into him. But anyway, we can get to that. So the Neoplatonic, sorry, this is a long history. I'm trying to do it
I
as
know.
briefly as I can.
And I feel bad now for even asking the question because I realize like that's a huge, huge question to ask. But
Yeah.
yeah,
So
you're doing great. So I
let me
think
try to,
actually,
I'll try to skip over some of the
yeah,
details. But
yeah.
so in the Neoplatonic uh, development of Platonism, there's this distinction between sort of like the one, which is absolutely central, absolutely simple and undivided and incomprehensible. And then there's sort of like, and then there's created things, the many things. But then there's like this intermediary between the one and the many, which is what is called the first multiplicity or the intellect.
Mm,
And the intellect is sort of the realm of the forms, the Platonic realm of the forms. So that's confusing in all sorts of ways. I don't know how I fully understand it. And obviously, like Christians aren't going to fully be on board with that way of thinking about things, although it sort of like has some resonances. And most importantly, like the resonance is the idea of like an intellect containing the forms, right? That
mm,
seems like kind of appealing from a Christian view, which is like because the Greek word form just is the word idea, right?
mm.
Um, so this idea that the forms of things are like ideas in the mind of God, that seems really appealing. And that became part of the Christian tradition. But then, and here's where I think there's a real parting of the ways, maybe, uh, between the Latin West and the Greek East is that um, when we get to Aquinas, right, Aquinas still has this idea that the forms of things are ideas in God. Right, he says the forms of all things pre-exist in God. Um, but now the question is, well, what about this participation relationship, right? Because for Plato, things are what they are by participating in the forms. And although this is kind of controversial, and Aquinas does have a lot to say about participation, uh, he seems to say that uh, for Aquinas, the forms are not true formal causes. The ideas of God are not true formal causes of things, in the sense that they're not that the things don't really participate in these forms that are in the mind of God. Um, and that mostly has to do with the idea of divine simplicity, right? Because uh, the idea, I mean, uh, at one point, Aquinas actually says that if God were the true formal causes of creatures, then that would lead to panentheism. I'm sorry, pantheism, right? Then everything would just have to be God because God is not divisible into parts. So if you participate in God, well, God is just one simple thing. So if you participate in God, that just basically means, God is your form, right? Because there's no sort of like differentiation between there's no real difference between these different parts in God, right? So if you participate in any part of God, you just participate in all of God. But that just means that right, God is your form, which means you are God, right? So that seems to lead directly to this pantheism.
Mm.
So Aquinas thinks that um, the forms are what he calls it exemplary causes of things. And so exemplary causes is sometimes thought of as a type of formal causation. But the important thing is that there isn't a real participation. So the exemplary causes they're kind of like, uh, I mean, again, this is like an anthropomorphic way of thinking about it. But the idea is that when God creates, the forms are sort of like his models, right? So like he creates things based on the model of these forms that pre-exist in him. Uh, and the insofar as there's like a relationship between the forms that are in things, which are created on this view, to the
Right.
forms that are in God, it's like a similarity relationship.
Mm.
Um, so it's not like this real metaphysical, ontological, participatory relationship. It's more just like a similarity relationship.
Yes.
And there's like a causal dependence, right? Because the forms are created based on uh, these ideas in the mind of God.
Right.
Whereas I think in the Eastern tradition, and especially in people like St. Maximus and St. Gregory, there's this much more clear and extreme uh, idea that actually no, there is like a genuine participation. God really is in all things, and things have their being through participation in God Himself. Um, so I think that's where the sort of like splitting of the ways metaphysically happens, more or less.
That is, no, that's very helpful. So, this whole idea of participating in the ideas or the forms that you find in Plato, and then this kind of distinction that you find later on in the medieval scholastic period, like you just talked about, where Aquinas kind of wants to deny that and move towards this kind of exemplarist position. That's starting to help, I think hopefully everyone listening to this, watching this can see where this would lead to a really kind of difference of views on how God relates to the world. And I think that really sets us up. So
I do want to say real
let's,
quick, I mean, I do want
oh,
to say too that
yeah,
like I also want to be careful because I know this is a problem that Orthodox people have had in the past century, few centuries especially. I don't want to sort of like identify the Latin tradition with Aquinas or say like this is the only way of thinking about things that they have or anything like that. And I definitely don't want to say, I mean, I think this is, I don't think we mentioned this yet, but Father James Dominic Rooney has had a paper responding to my paper come out recently, and he's done a podcast about it. Um, and he accuses me of saying like, oh, like the Latin West did this and it's bad, and the Greek East is better because they did this. And I'm not really interested in like
yes,
essentializing or even saying one is better than the other. All I'm trying to say is like, look, there's like this very important stream in the Latin sort of development of these ideas, and there's this important stream in the Greek speaking development of these ideas. And I just think they're different in interesting ways. And obviously I'm Orthodox, so I'm more interested in the sort of like Byzantine one, but I'm actually sort of to this day agnostic on whether these are like totally um uh sort of like incompatible with each other or whether there's not a way of understanding them that they ultimately don't contradict each other. So I just want to make that clear too.
yes. I'm actually, I'm glad you said that because there has been an unhealthy tendency sometimes, especially in the 20th century and even into the 21st century, of Orthodox theologians kind of to identify themselves in stark contrast to all the things they don't like about the West. And that's kind of like um, sometimes led to, I think, way overblown like statements about the differences, theological differences, or overblown statements about how terrible the West is and wrong. So that's definitely not something that you're in your paper that we're talking about that you are actually advocating for, or even in this discussion. All right, excellent. So yeah, you've done a great job, giving us these, explaining some of these Platonic ideas, and this really sets us up well to understanding St. Gregory's conception of panentheism. So could you tell us a little bit then about his conception of how God relates to the world?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, and I want to emphasize again that St. Gregory didn't see himself as sort of self-consciously developing this Platonic tradition anyway. He wasn't interested in metaphysics for its own sake. He was interested primarily in trying to defend these hesychasts, and in particular, defend the idea that they can have in their prayer a genuine experience of and a genuine knowledge of God. And this is problematic, or this is a difficulty that required all of his learning in its defense, because he accepted like there's this very clear stream in the theological tradition, very, very clear in the Cappadocians, that God in himself is completely unknowable, that he's beyond being, that he's beyond experience, that he's beyond knowledge. Um, and so, yeah, so the most fundamental question is, well, if that's true, how is it that we can have experience of God? How do we know God?
Mm.
Um, and Barlaam kind of thought apparently that, we know about God through basically doing philosophy. But defending the hesychasts, St. Gregory wanted to say, no, we can have this direct and real experience of God himself in this life. And so the question is, how is that possible?
Mm.
And so Gregory picks up on this distinction that's kind of there in the tradition, but wasn't, it's for the most part just kind of mentioned in passing. And he makes it central to his whole sort of project in these debates, at least especially later on in the debates. This distinction between God's essence and God's energy. And basically, this is just a distinction between God as he is in himself, God as he is in his nature, and God as he reveals himself in creation and reveals himself, God as he acts, right? So God as he expresses himself. But the important thing for St. Gregory is that these energies, right? Because energy just means, sorry if this wasn't clear yet, energy just means activity.
Mm.
It's the same Greek word that would normally be translated activity. And we can get into whether it's a good idea to translate it as energy or activity. I happen to think that it is because, God is just so different than us that when we think of activity, we're going to think of our own activities, and our
Mhm.
activities are not like God's activities in various ways. So anyway, but you can think of it as activity if it helps, right? It's God's acting. So there's God as he is in himself, and God as he acts to reveal himself and share himself. Um, but the important thing for St. Gregory is that God's energies are God, right? I mean, they're God's self-expression, if you want to think about it that way. But it is genuinely God that you're experiencing when God reveals himself, right? Um, and uh, so he thought this was an important distinction within God and a lot of people have thought that that's problematic because it somehow like undermines divine simplicity in some way. And this was like, I mean, to this day, this is a major sort of Roman Catholic criticism of, especially sort of like Thomistic inspired criticism of St. Gregory, is the idea that this essence energy distinction undermines divine simplicity.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think there are interesting questions there. I do think there's something to the way that this is typically defended in the Orthodox Church, which is by appeal to the distinction we make in the Trinity, right? So all Orthodox Christians already, although they think it's mysterious and we can't really fully understand or explain it, all Orthodox Christians are committed to thinking that um, there is sort of in God, so to speak, the nature and then the persons. But they also think the fact that there are three persons doesn't undermine the divine simplicity. It doesn't mean that there's three different things. There's not three gods. There's still just this one absolute God who is in three persons. Um, and so what someone defending St. Gregory might say is, well, look, if we're already willing to accept that there's this mysterious distinction in God between the nature and the persons, we can also, and in fact, St. Gregory thinks we're required to make sense of revelation and the experience of the saints and all these things. We're required to also make a distinction in God between God
Right.
and himself, God as he is in himself, and God as he acts, and God as he reveals himself. Um, so that's the basic essence energies distinction. Um, so yeah, so the important thing is these energies are God, right? So the idea is in defending the hesychast. So primarily he was interested in the question of like deification and experience of God. And what he wants to say is, well, they're not experiencing God's essence. They're not uniting themselves to God's essence, right? Because that would be pantheism. That would be literally becoming God by nature, which he doesn't think people can do. We become God by grace, as St. Maximus puts it.
Mhm.
Um, so we are sharing in God when we become divinized in salvation. The saints really are experiencing and being united to God, but they're not being united to God's essence. They're being united to God in his energies. So that's the primary way he uses it. But he also uses this distinction when he talks about creation, right? So he thinks that, right, because creation itself is an energy, right, in a sense, right? Creation just is one of the acts of God by which he reveals himself, and God is revealed in creation, right? And so connecting that with, so the first step here is connecting that with all these things that all the quotations from earlier church fathers that I mentioned earlier, where they say God is in all things, right? And all things participate in God. Well, in what way? Well, it seems like given this basic distinction that St. Gregory makes, albeit in a sort of different context between the essence of energies, what we should say is, well, God is in all things through his energies, right? Through his sustaining, creating activity of all things. Um, and then I kind of take this a step further to try to sort of make more precise how to understand this understanding of participation, or this understanding of the way in which God's energies are in things. And I admit that this goes a little bit beyond what any of the church fathers say, sort of as a theory, right? And that's mainly just because none of them were interested in giving a theory of the God-world relationship. They were interested in other things. But there's this quote from St. Gregory, which is in the 140 topics of natural and theological science on the moral and ascetic life, which can be found in volume 4 of the. I mean, it's translated separately, but the whole thing is in volume 4 of the Philokalia. So anyway, he says this: God both is and is said to be the nature of all things, insofar as all things partake of him and subsist by means of this participation. In this sense, he is the being of all beings, the form that is in all forms is the author of form, the wisdom of the wise, and simply the all of all things.
Hmm.
Right. So it's hard for me to imagine a more like, I mean, even
Yeah,
pantheistic sounding
that's pretty
saying than that.
explicit. Yeah, yeah,
Right. So it sounds pantheistic like that. I mean, he does go on to qualify this and he says, yet he is not nature because he transcends nature. He's not a being because he transcends being. He's not or doesn't possess a form because he transcends every form. So that's like straightforward
right.
panentheism, it sounds like, right? Based on the way I drew that distinction.
Yeah,
But what's interesting to me is this idea that God is in all things, right? We already know God's in all things through his energies, but here he's saying that God is the nature of all things, the form of all things, the being of the
yes,
being. Um,
yeah,
and so that leads me to sort of like raise as a sort of like a claim about how to think of Orthodox panentheism in a way that's more precise, that gets past this vagueness that all these philosophers accuse panentheism of having, and say, okay, well, here's the more or less precise way in which God is in all things and God, all things are in God. God is in all things in the sense that his activity, his creative activity, constitutes uh, the being of things. His activity is in all things, making them uh, the sorts of things that they are. And likewise, you can think all things are in God, right? Insofar as this relationship is defined as one as participation, right? So there's a sense in which by God actively informing me, in creating me, I am also participating in God Himself. Um, so so yeah, so that's the sense. So that's my attempt to say like, well, here's this sort of like tradition, and when we look at sort of like how this tradition culminates, and in particular, if we take really seriously some of these things that St. Gregory says here, um, the right way to be a panentheist, at least if you're Orthodox, is to say, um, yeah, God is in all things by his energies constituting the forms or the being of things that have form or that have being. So that's the
that's
view, more or less.
yeah. No, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for walking us through that. And kind of as I said before, I would be interested to hear. I know. So for those who don't know, um, Father Dominic Rooney, who we mentioned earlier, is a fairly well-known Roman Catholic philosopher and priest, and he has published a rather scathing response to Jeremiah's article. So, and he
So,
claims in that
so the paper is
response,
called the paper is called Orthodox Panentheism is neither orthodox nor coherent. Okay.
right? Yeah.
So yeah,
So
it's pretty
he's going
not pulling
straight.
any punches.
No, not pulling any punches. So I know that you are working currently on a response that will hopefully be published. And all of these papers, by the way, have been published in Religious Studies, which is a major journal in philosophy of religion, published by Cambridge University Press. And so I know you're working on a response, but I'd be just curious to hear. So maybe tell us one or two of the main objections that Father Rooney has to your conception of panentheism and why he thinks it's so incoherent, and then maybe some brief responses to what he said.
Yeah, I can try. It's something I'm still working on, like you said. And I mean, I also think he misunderstood various aspects of the view and on also the sort of the dialectic as I mean, I kind of already mentioned this, the dialectic as I set it up in the paper. So a lot of his response is sort of looking at the quotes that I give and saying, well, this isn't really the same thing uh, as the view that I give. But of course, like, yeah, I'm willing to admit that what I say goes beyond any of these guys. And initially the quotes aren't really are just to say that, look, these guys sound panentheistic.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's not really till we get to St. Gregory that we can try to give like a sense to what might be going on metaphysically, sort of
Yeah.
underneath their
Like
claim
a
about God and the world
plausible
relationship.
reading. One way to plausibly read and interpret these is as in a pantheistic way.
Yeah.
Um, may not
Uh,
be like maybe you can provide some kind of historical exegesis that proves that's not what they had in mind,
mhm.
but surface level reading and definitely the quotes you've shared, it's like that sounds very panentheistic. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, and I think the I'm not really sure how to distinguish between, right? So he seems to make it like there's one problem, which is that it's not orthodox. There's another problem that it's just like philosophically incoherent. But I actually think those are kind of the same thing.
Mhm.
So there's not really a clear argument that I could find that the view is like uh, incoherent in itself. I think his argument is that uh, if you accept this view, that it will lead to contradictions with like other things that Orthodox Christians are supposed to accept. Um, and so even then, it was a little bit hard for me to find super clear arguments. There's sort of two that I zeroed in upon on my response, and they both have to do with um, so on his view, and this is like comes from his scholastic framework. He thinks that if something is the form of something else, then it is a part of it,
Mhm.
right? So a form, he thinks, is a metaphysical or ontological part of the thing
Mhm.
that is the form of. Um, so first of all, I just hate that way of thinking about it. I don't think that's like that just seems to me wrong-headed. I mean, I know that there are some, especially like contemporary metaphysicians who think of forms that way. Um, I couldn't actually find that this is like a super clear part of like scholasticism in general, but I'll take his word for that. But I just don't like that way of thinking about it. It just seems wrong to me to think that a form that something's form is a part of it, right? Because the form is just in some sense uh, what it is, right? Uh, so like, how can what I am be a part? I mean, it's true that I'm not just my form, uh, right? And things aren't just their forms, but it just seems to me like again, part is clearly it's got to be a metaphor, and introducing metaphors when you don't need to just seems to me a tricky business, right? Because as soon as you introduce metaphors, especially drawn from like created things, and you're trying to relate that back to God, that's going to lead into some issues.
Yeah.
And so,
Well,
and
the
I think maybe
whole
that's actually what happens in some of his objections. Um, but anyway,
right.
so
Yeah, that notion of a metaphysical part, I mean, the whole idea of a metaphysical part, I think I've not come across anyone who really defines that very well. And like you said, it does seem clear that it's like a metaphor to, in a similar way as physical things have parts to them. Um,
yeah,
we can
but a form
think
is clearly not a part in that way.
metaphysically, but it's like, what does that mean? Yeah, so I'm
Yeah.
sympathetic to what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, he's written books on metaphysics, and metaphysics isn't my specialty area. So, I mean, I'll take his word for it. That if this is like the way people talk now, but I don't like it. And the fact that people talk this way doesn't automatically imply that like it's a good way of talking about it. But anyway, let's grant it for now, as long as we sort of keep in mind that a metaphysical part is like a very special kind of part. Um,
Mhm.
so here's like one clear expression of an objection that he raises to me. So he says, um, Carey's account on which the energies are ontological constituents or metaphysical parts of created objects akin to substantial forms would entail that God is a part of created things. And since the energies are God in some sense, since the energies are God in some sense, if God is a part of thing, though, it appears that as if created things would be divine.
Mhm.
So there is an argument here. So the argument seems to be something like, okay, look, I'm saying that God's energies are the forms of things. Let's grant that forms are in some sense parts of things. And let's also grant that energies are in some sense God. It follows from that that God is in some sense a part of things. Um, but if you might think if God is a part of something, then that thing would have to sort of would be divine. Uh, and why is that a problem? Well, you might think, well, if God is a part of things, then like God's properties would sort of like transfer over to that thing. If God is a part of me, then I've got to like be eternal and infinite and things like that because that's what God is. So there's an argument there, but it just seems to me a pretty bad argument. It seems to me to just kind of like miss the whole point of the essence energies distinction, right? So it's
Mhm.
true that I mean, again, I don't like this way of talking, but let's suppose it's true that God is a part of things insofar as his energies constitute the forms of those things. Um, and let's even grant that that in some sense makes the things divine, right? Uh, why is that a problem? Well, it's only a problem if God's being in those things in that sense means that they have uh, God's properties, or that they somehow have the same essential properties that God has. If you want to think about properties. Um, but that just doesn't seem to follow, right? It would only be true that if God is a part of me,
Mm.
that I am eternal because God is eternal by essence, if the part of me that was God's essence. Um, but that's precisely what St. Gregory's trying to deny, right? He's trying to deny that um, the energies, the things that are in my view, the forms of things are precisely not God's essence.
Hmm.
They're God's creative activity. And the precise reason to make that distinction is so that you can say that God is really in things, uh,
Hmm.
and yet that doesn't make those things God in the sense that they have, you know, God's essence. So I
Yes.
just don't really see it. And what's actually interesting to me that I might have to pull up this quote here, if I can do that without getting off screen, is I was reading through so Tikhon Pino has this new book on the essence energy distinction, which is super super detailed and complex. It's
Mm.
got to be the new standard discussion of this, and and Rooney even cites this book as an authority on
Mm.
St. Gregory. But what's interesting is even though I really hate this talk of parthood, apparently St. Gregory himself actually used this parthood talk and actually thought you should use this parthood talk. He actually thought it was right to say that that a part of God is in things.
Mm.
Um,
Interesting.
so, so yeah, I'll bring up this quote. So this is from the Pino book, but I think he quotes St. Gregory too. He says, um, all right, so this is on page 119 of the New Pino book. That participation in God is indeed partial and involves a literal, if not material, part of God, is a point that is stressed repeatedly by Palamas in order to prove that it cannot be the divine essence that is shared with creatures. Palamas points out that the word participation itself denotes not the possession of an essence or totality of essential attributes, but precisely possession of a part. What participates has part of what it participates in. If it partook not of a part, but of the whole, it would be properly said to have it, not partake of it. Um, so he's talking about part of God here rather than God being a part of us. But I think that the point is the same, right? The part of God that, on my view, constitutes the formal part of human beings is precisely not the essence. And precisely because that would imply the
Yeah.
sorts of problems that Rooney raises, right?
Yes.
Instead, right, it's the divine energy that we participate in, which is sort of like differentiated based on what sort of thing is involved. Um, so I just don't really see how the worry he raises there follows at all.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you giving that, kind of brief response to him. And I know that you're still kind of fleshing out your full response but I do agree with you. It sounds to me like um this is ultimately going to go back to the fundamental kind of disagreement that Thomists have, the Thomistic stream of classical theism has with the Palamite kind of tradition. This
Mhm.
idea that making an essence energies distinction is problematic. And I imagine too for Father Rooney, because if if he is a strict Thomist, which I think he is, he's going to conceive of the divine activities as being identical to the divine essence.
Yeah.
So there's no actual distinction. They're like what God does, his activities just is what, God's essence. So maybe that's the problem. Like you're saying, like if he's thinking of God in that way, then he's thinking, well, that's going to lead to this view that
Yeah.
everything's divine. Whereas you're saying, well, no, I'm holding to this essence energies distinction, and that allows me to avoid that problem. So, funnily enough, I think this really does come down from what I'm hearing. It comes down to that kind of classic disagreement between the Palamite tradition and the more Thomistic tradition.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think you're right. And the other main objection he raises is actually related to what you just said, right? And this is a little bit complicated because of the way St. Gregory talks about the essence and energies, right? Because insofar as St. Gregory wants to say the energies are God, he frequently talks about the energies being uncreated and eternal.
Mm.
And so another way that Rooney raises more or less the same worry is, well, look, if my form is an energy of God and the energies are eternal, then doesn't that mean that like God eternally like created me or something, or that sort of like my existence is necessary, right? Because
Mhm.
if my form is an eternal energy of God, then it's always been there with God. But then in some sense, right, since this is a part of me, I've
Mhm.
always had to have been there. Um, or something like that. It's not exactly clear, but there's a worry in that sort of area. Um,
Right.
but I just think here this gets into some more complicated issues in St. Gregory, but St. Gregory does distinguish between sort of like the uncreated eternal energies of God and sort of like which are eternal and uncreated, and the temporal manifestations of those energies. And sometimes he refers to the energy as like the eternal thing only, and sometimes he refers it to the manifestation of the eternal thing, right? So you can think of the eternal uncreated energy as more like a power or a capacity. And this is
Mhm.
actually in some ways similar to the Thomistic view, right? Because Aquinas also, like I said before, thinks that the forms of all things pre-exist in God. Um,
Yes.
but the sense in which they pre-exist is kind of like as the power to create these things. And so I think here we
Right.
just have to appeal to a similar sort of distinction, right? So there's a sense in which um, all of the forms are eternal energies in God, but only in the sense of like as the power to realize these. Um, but that doesn't, right? And it's true that sort of like if God's energies constitute my essence, that sort of I am essentially dependent on that energy. But the essential dependence doesn't go the other way, right? It's kind of like a
Mhm.
insofar as I'm created, God's energies are an essential part of me. But that only becomes true once God's eternal energy, which is the power to create me, becomes manifested in time through actually through him actually acting to constitute me as what I am.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yes.
Um, so I do think there's a little bit of complicated issues in that area. Um, but I don't think he's really gotten to the heart of the issues. And I think once you get clear on it, I just don't really think this is going to be a problem for the sort of like distinctive to the essence energy view. It's going to be a problem for any view which says that God somehow is like eternally the creator, or that the forms of things pre-exist in God, and yet that he didn't have to create them. I think
Mhm.
everybody's going to have to distinguish between sort of like what's in God as a power, a capacity, and um, and how God manifests that power. But again, I think the difference is that on the Orthodox view, when God manifests that power in creating, uh, his manifestation, God is fully present in that manifestation, right? And in that God in that manifestation, creation genuinely participates in God. Um, and so I think that's where maybe the Thomistic view is not quite willing to or able to go that far. But
Right.
yeah,
Yeah,
hopefully that makes
absolutely.
sense. These are bit complicated issues. I'm still kind of thinking through myself, but
Oh, no doubt. I mean, yeah, you're getting into some very complex, subtle metaphysics, and you're trying to deal with, medieval scholastic thoughts, Byzantine thoughts, and contemporary metaphysics. I mean, yeah, this is not an easy issue. So, well, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to do this with me. It means a lot.
yeah, like I said, I
Before,
haven't had a chance to talk serious philosophy for like 3 years. So this made my year so far for sure.
oh man, well that's awesome. Well, we'll have to do it again, and I mean that. I guess before we sign off, could you? I know obviously we've talked about you writing this response, but are there any other projects that you're working on that you'd want to plug?
Yeah, I'm sort of all over the place. I started a Substack recently, so it's on ancientpaths.substack.com where what I'm trying to use to sort of motivate myself to keep writing regularly and make some progress on these projects. I've got a couple of bigger projects that I'm hopeful I can complete. Um, so one of them is a defense of Christian vegetarianism, actually. Um,
Oh wow,
so I'm a vegan. I've been a vegan for about 5 or 6 years, and that's a pretty controversial position to take within the Orthodox Church. Um, and so yeah, so I'm interested in kind of doing a sort of like theological and philosophical case for why I think Christians in general, and that includes Orthodox Christians, should probably not eat meat. So that's one larger project that I'm working on, and I'm also hoping. to work with a friend of mine who is who studied Russian. He's a philosopher, but he did his undergraduate work in Russian. And so he and I came across this Russian new martyr. So he's actually a saint, Saint Valentin Sventsitsky, um, who's just like a super interesting figure. He sort of like co-founded this radical political movement that actually Florensky was actually part of a founding member of it, although he left after. Um, and so, yeah, he was kind of this sort of like super radical religious thinker who became a priest and then eventually was martyred in the Soviet regime. And it just he was made a saint by Rocor. Uh, at some point, I don't remember exactly when that happened. So he is officially canonically recognized as a saint. But he's very, very interesting, especially given that Rocor canonized him, since he was, as I said, he was like a political radical. He was very um, uh, had very interesting views on politics, I'll say. So anyway, but his writings, he's not very well known, and his writings are, I think, kind of like philosophically interesting, but haven't really been published. Um, so me and my friend Pete are hoping to like introduce and translate some works of his into English for the first time. Um, so we'll see
That
if that
sounds
happens. So those are the
brilliant.
two
Oh
bigger
man,
projects.
I hope it
Um,
does. That sounds great. Well, both projects sound really interesting, and I look forward to reading them. And I hope you stick with it. And the translation sounds like it might fit. Maybe that could give birth to some kind of paper that you might submit to the conference we're hoping to host in a couple of years.
Yeah, I
And
mean, there's one biographer that has written about this guy in Russian, and he seems to think that, I mean, a lot of what's original in a lot of these figures in the Russian religious Renaissance actually started with this guy. Um, so
wow,
so
really?
it would be
That
pretty
even
interesting if
yeah.
we could make some sort of argument to that effect. But it's a pretty long-term project, and obviously I don't understand Russian, so a lot of it is a lot of the heavy lifting is going to be done by uh, my hopeful co-author. Um,
Yes,
but yeah, I'll keep you up to date for sure.
please do. Well, thank you very much, and it's been really good talking to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a great time.